Good morning. Good to be with you. Glad that we can spend this time together in study. I was gone last week, Sunday night and Wednesday night, and I am very glad to be home. It was a good week. I was able to listen to some good, godly men and talk from God's Word, and I'm just overflowing with things to tell you. But we've got 30 minutes this morning, so I'll try to keep it reined in. Our world uses the word grace a lot, our religious world especially. And in general, they understand grace to mean something that is without response and without obligation. In fact, there are some people who would suggest that if you have to do anything in response to God's grace, then all of a sudden it's not grace anymore, right? That it can only be grace if it's just absolutely free with no obligation on your part. But as we read the New Testament, it is clear that human beings are required to respond to God's gracious action in a number of important ways. We see dozens of passages that explicitly call for a response to God's grace. And then I think the whole New Testament implies that there's a life that's to be lived in response to what God has done for us. So how do we pull those two things together? How do we pull together a definition of grace that says you can't respond to it and it still be grace, and all of these passages that say you must respond to the good things that God has done for you? Well, I want to contend with you this morning that as a religious world, we have missed what the Bible means when it talks about grace. That if by grace we mean something that is without response and that is without obligation on our part, we've missed the idea. But rather that the New Testament means by grace that it demands and expects and anticipates our response. In the New Testament, grace is always understood to be a kindness on God's part that demands an appropriate response on ours. In the New Testament, grace does mean that nothing forced God to give him what he has given us, but that it can only be received and maintained if we accept the obligations of the gift that he has offered. In order to make this point, we need to look a little bit at the world into which the New Testament was written, the first century Roman world. And so I'll talk a little bit about history and the way the word grace was used this morning. But sometimes when we look at the word grace in the New Testament, the definition that a lot of people give it is unmerited favor. Maybe you've heard that. And that's not a bad definition in certain places. But the Greek word is, and this is about as far as I know as far as Greek, so just hang with me, is charis, is how they would say it. But we get words like charity from that, right? And you think of charity as something that's a benefit or a blessing to someone else. And it's a similar idea here with charis. There are places in the Bible, though, where if you put the word unmerited favor there, it doesn't really work. And I'm not saying that that we deserve grace or that is something that we can somehow earn. Just hang with me. But that when we're defining this word charis, if we define it as something that is undeserved in every way, we miss the idea sometimes. For example, in the Old Testament, now you know that the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, but there was a Greek translation called the Septuagint. It's sometimes abbreviated LXX, but it has to do with the 70 men that translated it. So 70 is sometimes how it's abbreviated. So in the Septuagint translation of the Old Testament, which is the Greek version, we have an English version. They had a Greek version of the Old Testament. In Genesis chapter 6 and verse 8, when it says that Noah found favor, your text may say Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. In the Septuagint translation, that's our word charis. It's the same word translated grace in the New Testament. Now, I want you to think about this. When you're looking at Noah and Noah finding grace, was that completely unmerited? Was that something that there was not anything Noah had done to receive the eye of the Lord in that case? I don't think so. Now, did Noah deserve the salvation that God was going to offer him? No. But there was something different about Noah. And if there wasn't something different about Noah, then God's choice of him was just arbitrary, right? Here's all these completely wicked people. Well, there's a guy, Noah. No, Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. There was something Noah was doing. In fact, if you look at chapter 7 and verse 1, when God calls him to go into the ark, he says, for I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation. There was something about the way Noah was living that caught the eye of the Lord, that God noticed him because of that. Maybe an even clearer example of the way this word was used sometimes is in Genesis chapter 32. Genesis 32. And you'll remember this occasion. Jacob has run away from home because he was afraid that Esau was going to kill him. And now, more than 14 years later, he's making his return. And he's not sure that Esau has, forgotten what he had done to him. So remember that Jacob begins to send presents. He begins to send gifts ahead of him. And in Genesis 32 and verse 5, he says, I have oxen, donkeys, flocks, male servants, and female servants. I have sent to tell my Lord in order that I might find favor or grace in your sight. That's our word charis in the Septuagint. So notice that Jacob is saying, I'm trying to do things so that I can earn your charis. I'm trying to do things so that I can earn your grace. Now, did Jacob deserve that? No, right? Taking somebody's birthright, tricking their father into getting the blessing, that's not really, it's hard to make up for that sort of thing. But he's sending these presents along the way, trying to win the favor, trying to win the eye of Esau. When we come to the New Testament, there are several passages where the word unmerited favor just doesn't work. For example, remember how Jesus is described in Luke 2 and verse 52? This is after his temple scenario where he's asking questions and he's dealing with the religious leaders. And in Luke 2 and verse 52, the text tells us that Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor or in grace with God and man. Now, is that unmerited grace? Is that unmerited favor? No. Jesus deserved that because he was growing and he was developing in wisdom and in stature and in learning. And so he caught the eye of the Lord and he caught the eye of other people because of the life that he was living. It wasn't undeserved. It was as deserved as it could be. In Luke chapter 6 and verse 32, remember there Jesus says, if you love those who love you, what benefit or what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. That's the same word, benefit or credit. And then, maybe the most surprising is over in Romans chapter 7. Romans chapter 7. And this is one of the major ways in which this word is translated in our New Testaments. Romans 7 and verse 25. That first word, thanks, is the word grace. Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. Now you might say, how in the world is that translated thanks? Well, have you ever heard somebody say grace before you're going to eat the food? Or my grandfather used to say, express thanks. They're saying the same thing, right? Say thanks or turn thanks. I've heard a lot of older folks say. They're returning grace. Grace has been given and it's being returned. So you say grace. And so that's the idea of it there. Let me say that I think the word might be translated better in almost every instance as gift or favor. Not necessarily undeserved, sometimes undeserved, but not necessarily. And so in Romans 4 and verse 4, it says to the one who works, what his wages are not a gift, but what's due. So here's something that is a gift in contrast to that. You know, in the first century world, the word charis was not a religious word. Like most of the time, we only think of it in church context. But that's not how they would have thought of it. There was a social relationship in which charis would have shown up. And so this is the part where you might say, well, I don't care about Roman history. Well, I don't either for the most part. But I do care about understanding when Paul used the word grace, how did his hearers understand that? And that's what I want to try to get at. So in the first century world, there was a system of social relationships that was the most important social relationship in the Roman Empire. One of my favorite little history books on ancient Rome says, if you don't understand this patron relationship, you can't understand the Roman Empire. All right? So the idea here is that there would be a patron, sometimes called a benefactor. And let's say that this person's wealthy, most of them were, and they would have clients. They'd have ordinary people like me, and they would give me money, or they would give me food, or they would give me protection, or they might represent me in court. They might do something like that. And the idea is that they are then going to bestow a favor. They're going to bestow blessings on people. And they become known as the patron. You know, we have modern examples of the patron. If you go to Pittsburgh, there are streets, there are schools, there are libraries, all named after Andrew Carnegie. Because he just, before he died, he gave millions of dollars. I think I heard that he gave more away than anybody else had ever made in their lifetime when he died. And so the Carnegie Library. Maybe you've heard of the Carnegie Library. It's the largest privately funded library. It still self-sustains off of the money that he left for it. However many years, 100 years ago. Well, he was a patron, right? He was dying. He wasn't going to get any benefit from that. Now we're going to talk more about how that exchange works. But think of the idea of a patron. In Russellville, Pilgrims is the new patron, right? They built that splash pad, and it's got Pilgrim's name right there on it. Well, they're trying to give a benefit to the community. Well, in response to that, you would have a client or a beneficiary. Now, we only use the word beneficiary mostly when it comes to life insurance policies, but we know what that means, right? We're talking about here's somebody who's receiving the benefit. But in response to the gift that the patron would give, the appropriate way to respond was the client would give their loyalty, would give their services, and would give their gratitude to the person who would bless them. Does that make sense? Now, there's one other word, and that is the word to describe the transaction on both sides was grace. So the gift that was given from the patron to the client, charis. The response of loyalty and thanks to the patron, charis. Now you might say, but really the client doesn't have the stuff to give to the patron in the same way. No, he does not. But it's like I was teaching Leo to ride his bike. Now Leo could not teach himself to ride his bike, but I could. So I went and I taught him how to ride his bike. I'm his patron in that regard. I give him something that he can't get on his own. Well, then later, I'm standing in the bedroom and he brings me a picture. Now, it's not going to end up in the Louvre, okay? It's not going to be in the Alabama Museum of Art. I didn't know what it was. I said, what is it? He said, it's you teaching me how to ride a bike. And I cried like a baby. Now, did I do that because this is the most, artistically advanced piece of paper I've ever seen? No. But in his efforts to show me his appreciation, man, it broke me. All right, so that's grace. It is a gift in one way, and it's a gift in the other way. And I could not, if I had gone to Leo and I had said, you better draw me a picture because I told you, well, that's not grace anymore, right? It is a mutual exchange of blessing and favor and gift and thanks. You see how that works? Now, there's one other word that will come into play down the road, and that's the word mediator or broker. Let's say there's some patron who I know could help me, right? I need his representation in the government. I need him to help my city. Well, I don't know him, but you do. And I go to you, and you go to him and say, hey, I have this friend, and I need you to help him. That person was called a broker or a mediator. You might recognize the word mediator from our New Testament. Now, Landon read for us a passage, and thinking about illustrating that, I have a friend who somebody else was going to try to get him to do a favor, and he was kind of iffy on it. And then Jackie Richardson called. And somebody said, well, why'd you end up doing it? He said, it was Jackie. What are you going to do? Like Jackie had done so much for him that when he called, he's the mediator, he's the broker. He said, what are you going to do? I didn't have an option. And that's very much how this system worked in the ancient world. Let me just use Luke chapter 7 to illustrate that Landon read for us. You see here, notice that the centurion, he is a patron, right? He built their synagogue. That's what a patron does. And now these guys, the Jews that are sent to Jesus, they have become his brokers or his mediators. They have come to Jesus because the centurion recognizes that even though he is a patron, in this situation, he doesn't have what he needs. So he's got to go to a greater patron. He's got to go to a greater benefactor. But he doesn't know it. But these Jews do. And so they go to Jesus and they say, this man is worthy of your attention. And so Jesus, as the great patron, bestows this gift on the centurion. And it's grace. It's a gift. And we learn a lot about this relationship, not from the New Testament directly, but have you ever seen a Miss Manners column, right? Where somebody writes in a question, it's in the newspaper, And, how should I act in this social situation? Where does my salad fork go or something like that? And most people, I don't know the rules of all that, but, some of those are like unwritten rules. But then somebody comes along and writes all those down. Well, we have people in the Roman world who, even though these were kind of the unwritten rules of the first century, went ahead and wrote those down. And so we have insight into all of that. In both directions, the language that was used to describe what was given, both what the patron gave to the client and what the client returned to the patron, was a gift. Now, in the writings and illustrations of the first century, this was often depicted as three women holding hands and dancing. Now, I would like to show you a picture of a statue because they're all over the ancient world. But they are Greek statues, and they are not dressed appropriately. So I could not show you pictures. But just imagine three modestly dressed women holding hands and dancing in a circle. All right? And what the first century authors tell us is that grace was depicted as three women dancing together because it illustrated the way in which grace works. One of the graces was the devotion, the willingness to help, the disposition to help. The other grace was the gift itself. And the third grace was the return of thanks and gratitude. Now imagine this picture. They're doing Ring Around the Rosie and they're dancing together. And the idea is any one of them does not, if any part of that is broken, the dance falls apart, right? It is a relationship. So here's the picture. Here's one who is willing to give. Here is the gift that is given, and here is the return of thanks. And as long as that cycle continues, the dance continues. But as soon as any part of that falters, they're on each other's toes, right? The dance falls apart. Now we see this in our New Testament. Look in Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 9. Hebrews 2 and verse 9. We won't look at all these passages. I just want to show you that there are plenty that we could look at that would illustrate this. So this is just in the book of Hebrews. In Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 9, it says, "But we see him who for a little while was made lower than the angels, namely Jesus, crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for every man." So here you have this willingness to help, this disposition of God, this desire to give a benefit. And it's by that grace that Jesus was sent to taste death for every man. So that's the attitude of giving. That's got to be there. And then second, there is the gift itself. So in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 16, the latter part of that verse, actually the word is used in two different ways in this text. In 4:16, at the beginning of the verse, let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace. I think that's the idea of the disposition to help, the willingness to help, so that we might receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. That's the gift itself. That's the blessing. That's the favor. But then the word is used in the book of Hebrews to describe the gratitude with which we respond. In Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 28, it says, "Therefore let us be grateful. Let us give grace." That can be translated. Let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, and let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe. And so you have this dance, perfectly non-lascivious dance, right? Where you've got a gift that's being given, the desire in God's heart to give that, and then our response of gratitude. And as long as that cycle continues, the dance is beautiful. But if at any point that falters, and it's not going to falter on God's end, it will falter on ours. If at any point it falters, the relationship falls apart. I hope all of that makes sense. If it doesn't, I'll have a part 2. Now, let's look at this in the book of Romans. God is already a patron. He is already a benefactor before salvation ever comes into the picture. God has given us life. He has given us His Word. He has given us instructions to guide us. He is already a patron. But how have people responded to that? Have they responded in gratitude? Have they responded in loyalty? No. In fact, in Romans chapter 1 and verse 18, it says, "The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness, of men who by their unrighteousness suppress truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them, for his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world, in the things that have been made, so that they are without excuse. But notice this, verse 21. Although they knew God, they did not honor God or give thanks. And where does that lead them? It leads them down a spiraling path of giving someone else the credit for everything and replacing their patron with created things, with idols and with images, and completely disregarding the conditions of the patron. And so it is right that God's wrath is revealed against that. And when you look at the Jewish people in Romans chapter 2 and verse 23, you who boast in the law dishonor God by breaking the law. For as it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. Not only had God given them life, he had given them the law, and instead of responding to that with gratitude and obedience, they disregard him, and his name is blasphemed. And there was one thing in the first century in the Roman world you didn't want to do, was blaspheme the name of your patron. Because then that relationship crumbles. And so to use our image here, God gave life, and he gave the law, and he gave patience. He gave long patience. But what did humanity do? They failed to return grace, and the relationship was broken. But God, even though he had the right to bring wrath on the world, he gave grace upon grace. He gave even more grace. He is a patron who, even when slighted by his clients, says, but I'm not done with that relationship. And he goes even further in giving grace. In Romans chapter 5 and verse 8, Paul says here, but God shows his love for us, and that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And the other words that are used here are his enemies. When we took his blessings and we spit in his face, he said, you know what? I'm going to give more grace. I'm going to demonstrate more love. And so now he offers a new opportunity to receive and respond to God's offer of life and favor. And so maybe we can picture it like this. He gave life and the law and patience, plus love in Christ. And humanity, now the question is, what will they do with that? Well, God's favor requires a response. It always has. God's grace has always required a response. So think about this. Exodus 19. God is speaking to the people who have come up out of Egypt, actually speaking to Moses. And he tells him to tell the people, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I brought you up and brought you to myself, how I bore you on eagle's wings. Now, therefore, if indeed you will obey my voice, you will be my treasured possession among all peoples. For all the earth is mine. And you will be to me a holy nation, a kingdom of priests. You see what God's saying there? What did they do to deserve being rescued out of Egypt? Not one thing. But he says, now that I've done that, this is how you respond. And if you don't respond in this way, then you will not be my special people. You will not be my treasured possession. You will not be my kingdom of priests. And so you see that relationship, how it goes on. In Exodus chapter 20, he says, I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. You shall have no other gods before me. God's rescue of them, his grace, his favor toward them demanded their exclusive loyalty and obedience. No other patron had any claim on them because God was the one who had rescued them. God's grace always has demanded that the recipients respond in gratitude and obedience. A first century writer named Seneca, who wrote a long dissertation called On Benefits, on Grace, said, to fail to return gratitude is a disgrace, and the whole world counts it as such. And I think we still have some of that. Right? You do a favor for someone, and they act as if you were obligated to do that, or they act as if they deserved it. Boy, it really ruins the grace relationship, doesn't it? So, God's grace, God's favor requires a response. I want you to look at this in Romans chapter 6, and there's obviously more we could say. In Romans chapter 6 and verse 12, he says, let not sin therefore reign in your mortal body to make you obey its passions. Do not present your members to sin as instruments for unrighteousness, but present yourselves to God as those who have been brought from death to life, and your members to God as instruments for righteousness. For sin will have dominion over you, since you are not under law, but under grace. I think some people come to this passage and they say, look, we're not under law anymore. We're under grace, so we can do whatever we want. Is that the point Paul's making here? No, Paul's saying there's more of an obligation because you are under grace to do even more in God's service. Because you're not under a law relationship anymore. You're under a grace relationship. You know, I have a law relationship with the IRS. I want to do precisely the amount that they ask me to and not one penny more to make sure they stay away. Right? That's all I'm trying to do. I'm trying to do I don't send them a kind note and say, listen, I think we should be pen pals. And the more that we can have a conversation, you can come visit. I don't want them to come visit, right? If they come visit, something has gone terribly wrong, right? That is a law relationship. I'm not trying to break the law, but I'm not trying to butter them up. You know what I mean? Now, imagine that if I approach a grace relationship like Lydia and I have, like a law relationship. Like, all right, what do you need me to do today? And what's the bare minimum I can get away with? Now, when I start acting like that, the relationship is breaking down, right? Because that's not what that relationship is supposed to be. It is supposed to be a relationship in which I understand the great benefits and the great grace that she has shown me by marrying me, right? I can't trust any of her judgments from now on, but that was a great benefit. And I want to respond with thanks and with grace to her. Now, which one do I feel has more demands of me? That one. Because it's not just about making sure I check off the boxes. Now, when we come back to thinking about the gospel, do we say that as a result of us not being under law anymore, well, that frees me from all the obligations? No. Here your patron has blessed you and blessed grace upon grace. And the response is, take me. Take all I have, because that's all I have to give. I think that's what was happening in Matthew 5 with the law and the way the Pharisees were interpreting it. Right? They read the law, and they kept their eyes on the law and not on the one who gave them the law. And so as a result of that, they were saying, well, I hadn't murdered anybody. I hadn't committed adultery. I haven't done whatever. And so they've got that law relationship, and everything is fine. And Jesus says, if you had only had your eyes on the lawgiver, you would have recognized that what he was doing was calling you into a relationship where you could be like him. And that you would not have been satisfied with this shallow interpretation of the law, but you would have taken it to its full measure, and you would have known what I'm telling you. That you've got to root anger out of your heart, and lust out, and love your enemies, and pray for them. That's what a grace relationship would have looked like. But they had missed it. So Paul says in Romans 6, you're not under law, you're under grace. And somebody says, well, I guess I can do whatever I want to, grace upon grace. And Paul would say, God forbid, how shall we who have died to sin live any longer therein? You know, that theme runs all through the Scriptures. I love 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 14. 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 14, where Paul says, the love of Christ compels us. The love of Christ constrains us. He says, because we have concluded this, that one has died for all, therefore all have died. And he died for all, that those who live might no longer live for themselves, but for him who for their sake died and was raised. Here Christ has given his life, and as we sang, as Austin led for us, he says, at the cross where you gave your life for me, Lord, I lay my life at your feet. That's the idea. You have given me your life. Here is mine in return. And it's not as good as yours. And it's not as effective. But it's all I have to give. I think we're going to sing before the Lord's Supper. If I had all the world to pay back, it wouldn't be enough. But you know what this grace demands? My soul, my life, my all. There was one writer in the first century who said that when a patron gives a gift, when the client can't repay, the client says, when you have given me this benefit, even though I can't repay it, I will never stop talking about my inability to repay it. Not just to you, but to everybody. I'll never stop talking. That is a response of grace. In Galatians chapter 2 and verse 20, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. The life which I now live, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. He has given himself for me. Now I'm dead. And I belong to him. And he has my whole being. Romans chapter 12. Paul says, I beseech you, therefore, by the mercies of God, based on what God has done for you, based on his goodness, that you present your bodies as living sacrifices. You're dead. You are offered on the altar, which is your reasonable service. It's the exact right response to what God has done for us. When he has shown grace upon grace, we show gratitude. And we give our lives as a living sacrifice. God's gift, God's favor, is not a one-way transaction. But the question remains whether or not we will return his grace in loyalty and gratitude. That question stands before every one of us. Will we keep that relationship going, or will we say, thanks, and then dismiss what he has done for us? It is an act that creates a relationship and makes a relationship possible for human beings. It was intended to create a mutual cycle of gift and gratitude. And we give ourselves because he has given to us. I hope you see the practical implications of this. I hope I see them in my own life. That I don't need to be thinking, well, do I have to? What's the bare minimum I can get away with this week? But I need to be reflecting on the great grace that has been given to me and looking for ways that I can proclaim the excellencies of him who called me. Looking for ways that I can demonstrate my loyalty to the patron who has done for me what I could never do for myself. And looking for ways where I can take those gifts that I've been given and I can spread them abroad so that they will return thanks to the one who made them too, so that God will be glorified. In all things, may God's glory be magnified. Well, that draws the lesson to a close. If you're here this morning and you realize that you have not been returning thanks to God in your words and in your life, today's the day that that relationship can be mended. Because God still, today, right now, this moment, right here, is grace upon grace upon grace. We have an opportunity to come in a relationship with him, to be blessed by being his client, by being his beneficiary, so that we can share with him in glory when this is over. If you're subject to the invitation of God, won't you come while we stand, while we sing?
Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.